your long tenure as curator of American Furniture and Decorative Arts, go to become director of the Independent Landmark Society. And I thought we might look back over your rather long tenure here and get your feelings about your achievements and the changes that have occurred. How did you end up here in the first place?
At the end of my second year as a graduate student at Curator, there was a summer research assistance opportunity in Hartford, looking at the walls, not in collection. And my mentor and teacher at Curator, Benno Foreman, who was a kind of inspiration to a whole generation of furniture historians, said, look, this isn't a job, this is a project, and it'll be short, but it's a wonderful opportunity. You should go and do this thing. Just go to Hartford. You'll never have a better opportunity to learn the early colonial furniture and to really immerse yourself in it. So I wrote Philip Johnson a letter confirming my interest in it. I guess he and Ben had talked on the phone, and it was a week later I was arriving on Hartford's doorstep with my life's possessions packed into a Chevette, and wound up with a dorm room at Trinity College, renting a room in one of the fraternity houses for the summer because I was planning to be here for the summer. Melinda Sullivan had stepped in and made it possible for me to stay for the fall, and wanted me to continue on the project that I made a lot of progress with during June, July, and August. And so I now had another sort of extension of this into the fall, and then I was here in October when he announced his intent to leave, and so suddenly the department was going to be vacated, and I had an interim position as an adjunct curator, which I remained for a year or so before I was finally actually offered full-time jobs. Yeah, my office initially was on the balcony of AVERY 2, in the basement across an SPF 06 across from the registrar's office. Yes. My assignment was to catalog the Not In collection and to begin progressing toward a catalog publication. And I'm sure that Philip Johnson, my predecessor, intended to write that catalog. I was basically gathering data for him. He was going to produce a collection catalog. And but he left, and I've continued on the project. And actually, one of my regrets is that publication never really saw the light of day. I was involved with it. I probably put it in jeopardy somewhat myself by launching the Connecticut Valley project, but I did actually finish the manuscript, and there is, as I leave, I can still point to approximately 400-page manuscript for a collection catalog for the Wallace Nutting collection that never was published because, the museum, as far as I can recall, European paints and American paints catalogs were in process all through this period. On projects, unfunded collection catalog projects in the works that, it's a good serviceable manuscript that is still used and useful as a interpretive record of the individual components of the Nutting collection.
But then, what gave you the idea of doing the Great River? That was your first big project?
Yeah, it was, I did two small exhibitions from the permanent collection, the Nutting collection. We did an exhibition on chests and another one on chairs, and they were both fine. Neither of them they're all low budget and attractive, but I remember writing in my Curator application when they had a test question or an essay question about what you want to be doing 5 years after you graduate. I said my dream in life was to mount an exhibition of regional art centered in some important part of New England, and that would leave the door open to Vermont, Essex County, or the Connecticut Valley. But I'd spent a lot of time in the Valley, had written my master's thesis on the Connecticut Valley topic, and was not only thrilled to be in Hartford, which still feels like the cultural capital of the river region, but also, to have this as subject matter for an exhibit. Some months after arriving here, realized that Connecticut was about to celebrate its 350th birthday anniversary in 1985, and I thought, boy, this we could sell. If it was not a big exhibition for 350th, like they had done in 1935 at the time of the 300th, and was sort of aware even by then of the extraordinary achievement of the Tercentenary Commission, and felt that we could bring it up to date, that there'd never really been a comprehensive study of the regional arts of the Connecticut Valley, that we have to mean a hell of a lot. The Nutting collection had quite a stake in that subject. And So I proposed this, and we got, National Endowment for Humanities and Luce Foundation funding, and Travelers Corporate Company as a sponsor. And, right place at the right time. The 80s was a growth period. It's just an extraordinary opportunity for me, really, to be able to mount a major loan show at that age. And
you did exhaustive research for it.
Almost too much so. I still think about it. I always joke about it taking 5 years. You get into this kind of scholarly sort of mindset before you begin to write or say anything. And, I am immensely proud of the Great River Archive, an extraordinary resource. I and Betsy Fox and my army of research volunteers, we read thousands of probate inventories, transcribed and analyzed hundreds of Connecticut River Valley account books, did research in Middletown, Hartford, Springfield, Northampton, Greenfield, Massachusetts, and we read the Hartford and Northampton newspapers basically every day from their first publishing date until 1820. And, trolling through looking for information about artisans and art patronage, and it was a enormous research effort, and we also visited every public collection in the Connecticut Valley, almost 140 public collections, photographed 7,000 objects, visited also 120 or more private collections, and the photographic archive of some 7,000 artifacts. Our model for this was the field research effort of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, which had been blazing a trail in this way in the 1970s, and there was really quite a precedent for these intensive regional studies, but nothing like this had ever been done here, and frankly it was overkill a little bit. My more recent projects like Colt probably used 3/4 of what we gathered, and that's a lot more efficient. We gathered a lot of stuff, but we used it much more intensively. But I think the archive, the time will come maybe 10 years from now, 30 years from now, when somebody will be carrying the torch on the subject and think, my gosh, look at this mountain of data. What an extraordinary resource. We can do all of this without even leaving Wadsworth Atheneum.
What do you think the exhibition itself meant?
Well, the Great River was not inconsistent. There were several projects that had been going on in the period, in fact, that were contemporaneous with it. The model for this really was the New England Begins, Museum of Fine Arts in Boston's epic story of the 17th century, which I still regard as like this. I've never seen another exhibition that involved more intensive and thoughtful. It is to the late 20th century with the Egyptologists, the turn of the century, were a monument to scholarship and high-mindedness. Grey River was not in many ways as ambitious. It was not as big of a project, but it was almost as big. And for a much smaller institution to have carried that on was pretty unusual. The other model at the time was the Pennsylvania German exhibition that the Philadelphia Museum of Art mounted, and that also was a joint venture between Curator and the Philadelphia Museum. And all of these projects shared in common a kind of multimedia, interdisciplinary approach to the subject of art, where they brought together architecture and furniture and a variety of decorative arts and tried to explore, what was called material culture, but really is cultural studies, social history, using art as a focal point. I think that was a movement that is maybe past a little bit, will remain as a milestone in that movement and will be regarded as one of the major projects. Yeah, we only printed 3,000. I remember having a kind of a cat fight with my former director, Tracy Atherley, the man that hired me, and somebody I respect enormously, was intensely skeptical and pessimistic about prospects. Just was terrified of the idea that we were going to get left with a surplus of books in the basement. And I remember really going to the man fighting to see that we printed 3,000. Of course, I now deeply regret we didn't print 5 or 10 even, because I think actually it's continued to have a market and will always have a growing market for that book. The Great River is a reference book, and it will never be superseded. Somebody may revisit the Connecticut Valley and do something more interesting than we did with it, but certainly that kind of approach will never be superseded. Yeah, that was Gregory Hedberg's project and reinstallation of the American Galleries, not even a catalog. Initially, and from the outset, conceived as a component of the reinstallation. So the big effort, the thing I really threw myself into in the mid-early 80s was the reinstallation of the American Galleries. It started out as a project to reinstall the 90th collection, and then turned into a comprehensive reinstallation. And dedication of the Avery Memorial to the subject of American art. I have to commend Gregory Hedberg for seeing the big picture and into the larger purpose. Nutting thing, this is my big debut as a career professional. I want to reinstall the nutting collection and rentals that they were trying to turn it into something more. It was to expand it into areas that I didn't feel confident. You know, I really had studied the whole collection. They wanted us to reinstall silver, ceramics, glass, metalworks, everything simultaneously. And I'd spent all this time working on nutting, really didn't feel I knew the other stuff. So I quickly called in a consultant, Arlene Schwinn, on ceramics and glass, and then Janine Scarry, who's now the curator of ceramics and silver at Colonial Williamsburg, were called in to advise and help assist in the effort. And actually, Janine, who's really had a terrific museum career and is a really gifted curator, this was her first professional project, and I was very proud of the team that I amassed, not only for the Great River, but some people that really have gone on to illustrious things. Kevin Sweeney, who was the director of the Webb Dean Stevens Museum in Wethersfield, but he's now a tenured professor of history at Amherst College, which is no mean accomplishment. And Robert St. George, who's the director of the folklore program at the University of Pennsylvania, was basically just out of graduate school at the time, and Phil Zay, the deputy director of historic Deerfield, now was just out of school. Jay Nylander, who was a curator at Sturbridge Village, is now the director of the Society for Preservation of Antiquities. These were people who were gone on really to illustrious things, and we're all part of our little band, Valley Boys and Girls. So, I think Gregory really was right on. It was a great, thrilling adventure to reinstall the American Gallery. I'll never forget being almost physically ill on the eve of that, because this was my first public thing, throwing a party and nobody telling me. We had it was such a memorable, the best opening I ever attended here was the American Gallery. Yeah, it was celebratory, it was warm, it was humanistic. We had colleagues and peers from New York and Boston and interior New England. I mean, it was really an extraordinary moment for American art, and it was a unified moment. And the program of American art has never been more rigorous. But in 1984, at the end of the year, the New York Times cited the reopening of the American Galleries as one of the milestones in 1984 in the world of art. It had gotten a big send-up in the Sunday New York Times the week that it opened, but at the end of the year in Roundup, it got a greatest hit citation from the New York Times. And, that was a huge deal. I was 29 years old.
A lot of it was not out, actually.
Yeah, probably half of the good stuff was in storage, and only half of the great stuff was being shown. I mean, including my very favorite object is the Henry Treat chest. I actually came from William Goodwin, but was added to the nutting and related collections of Pilgrim furniture. It's the earliest dated Connecticut artifact, 1673. It's an extraordinary work of art, and it's one of the crown jewels of the collection. I love that object, and I think there are a lot of major things in that story. So, we got a lot more of the collection out. I mean, that was Tracy Atkinson's vision of Project Iceberg. So had such an instinctively populist dimension to it, because Tracy actually got it, that the public perceived art museum, that there's a perception that the art museum is keeping a secret, is not letting you in on the deal. And so Project Iceberg was kind of a marketing hook that basically said, look, we agree with you. We are sitting on an iceberg, and you've only been seeing the tip, and we're going to fix that. And its goal was to enhance and increase the quantity as well as the quality of art displayed here. The American Galleries was a signature project of Iceberg, because it was the most dramatic demonstration that we were in fact sitting on treasures that people didn't know about, that we were not sharing. The space devoted to American art tripled basically overnight, and that effect was dazzling. It was really, really cool, and the American paintings and prints, and I still love those galleries. Younger then, I don't think I could do it now, but in those days I was single, and I was just here all the time, frequently here till 11 p.m. and they had to throw me out, and where's Bill? And there was at least one occasion where I fell asleep at my desk and spent the night here. I spent Christmas Eve 1984 working on the Great River catalog. After the Great River, for a variety of reasons, I got married, so it was hard, but I was very ambitious, and I wanted very much for these projects. I mean, these are like, Gene, with the work that you've done. It is indescribable, the emotional attachment that one develops, not only for the subject matter, but the collection. Anybody that has written a biography or told a story, or has looked after a collection, understands that this is my life, this is who I am. It was actually the Wetmore Parlor I'll never forget, it was actually in the last thing I did, the last week of the Great River, I think 3 weeks before the Great River, I wrote a letter to Sam and Bunny Green, suggesting they come out and see the exhibit before it closed, and inquiring about the status of this legendary famous room, which I did know had been targeted and was sort of in the crosshairs of dealers, and there'd been talk, and we wanted to include a photograph of it. I don't remember what happened, but it wasn't in the Great River book. But this was the greatest 18th century interior court in the Connecticut Valley. Anyway, short version is that turned out that yes, they'd been worrying for years about it, and yes, they were planning to sell the room, and which was sort of an appalling thought, but the Metropolitan Sotheby's were brought in. We wound up in a cat fight with Sotheby's and the Metropolitan Museum and basically played the regional patriotism card hard enough and aggressively enough that we won. And again, I want to credit Gregory Hedberg, and I think specifically Dorothy Archibald, Betsy Campbell, Georgette Koopman, the committee. I'm talking about the group of trustees on the collections committee who were really... See, Gregory Hedberg really didn't care about Americana all that much. He was into paintings and stuff, and I don't think he would care about this room particularly when I proposed it, except for one thing. When he was in Minneapolis, the Metropolitan apparently had snuck into Minneapolis and snagged the greatest of Frank Lloyd Wright's interiors right out from under the community and installed the great room at the Metropolitan Frank Lloyd Wright interior and embarrassed them, humiliated them in their own backyard with their own community. There was a great sense of where the hell were you when the Metropolitan was sniffing around, and basically Gregory's motivation was vindictiveness. I mean, he was going to be goddamned if the Metropolitan was going to scoop him twice in his backyard. And I had no idea of any of this history, so when I played this room card and turned out the map was like circling, the dead carcass of this room from 300 feet above the sky, like vultures, right? Gregory, I've never seen, the guy was a real competitor. He didn't like me, and I never saw him get so excited. Had that thing through the system here, and we wound, it was a $250,000 acquisition, which at that time was, there've been bigger things. I think Richard Saunders acquired the O'Keefe for $400,000, and as far as I know, that may have been the most money ever spent on a picture of this. Hedberg was not afraid to spend that kind of money. And it required mobilizing. I'll never forget the trustees going down to Middletown and tromping around this whole delegation of them, sort of tromping up the steps through the mud and looking at this road and negotiating this thing and having these power breakfasts at Hartford. It was really thrilling. I'll never forget Jim Lyon on one side. Maybe we had this final breakfast after much courting and discussion. And the final closer was apparently Bunny Green herself. I think was in our court. I think Sam had divided loyalties. And I think Bunny basically planted a trick question with the method. They always claim the decisive thing was timing. They said, no, but Bunny said to the Metropolitan, do you think if we sold you the room, you could have it installed? How soon do you think you could have it installed? Do you think you could have it installed in 2 years? Within 2 years? And they said, oh, we certainly think 2 years we could do. And she already knew that I promised we'd have it up in the public domain in 6 months. And we did. We turned that around like in a heartbeat. It was an extraordinary project. The room had to be removed, an environment created for it, and reinstalled, and the original woodwork reproduced and reinstalled and reassembled in the original site. It was a big project, and only half the cost was moving the room and installing it. The other half was the actual purchase price. It's one of the great interiors in an American museum, and what I really love about it, whenever I give tours of the collection, it's the perfect threshold for raising all of the issues that the experience in American art here. It's architecture, it's environment, it's paint, it's place, it's furnishings and context. I mean, it's just, you can introduce many of the themes of the permanent collection in that one space, sort of tie it all together. And country cosmopolitanism, I mean, it is a wonderful metaphor for the Wadsworth Atheneum itself, because it's, we're not, I may not always, the administration may not always agree. I think the Atheneum has always been its best and most brilliant and intelligent when it had its own sense of place properly understood, where it didn't aspire to be the Louvre and the Met, when it understood that cosmopolitanism and regionalism are not incompatible, and that you can be both aspiring and global in your perspective, and yet also honoring the traditions of your immediate locale. The Hadley chest is certainly the Sheldon family chest, which we bought by Farnsworth Museum in Rockland. Rockport, Maine, was kind of a byproduct of some deaccessioning we did in the mid-80s, early 90s, excuse me, from the Wadsworth collection. I suppose one of my regrets, and I don't know, it's been a persistent irritant to the curators in this office, where I Frank Sumner, from the wording of the will, restricted to pictures. The decorative arts curators have never really had access to the big purchase fund. But I think what was heartbreaking to me was the Dorothy Potter Smith fund that my predecessor Henry Maynard played so key a role in building. He was the principal relationship that she had in this institution, and unquestionably played a key role in cementing her loyalties. This was after Sumner, the next biggest fund, and that is not a restricted fund, and that should have been devoted in part to decorative arts. Most of my accessions were driven by deaccessions, so that I never really had a lot of money to spend. I suppose the paintings colleagues will say that you get your stuff in a different way because this is what people have around here. They donate it to us. But there's no sophisticated museum in the country that you cannot get there without access to purchase funds. There have been other things. I mean, I love this Boston walnut chair that I bought in 1984. It's a great story behind sort of the drama of the acquisition. Wonderful piece of silver that belonged to the Gardner family of Gardner's Island in Long Island in the 17th century. And I launched this agenda with the Victorian arts. Probably my most important legacy in acquisition was in the 19th century. We bought lots of little things. The Victorian decorative art, the collection that I began to build never did see the light of day in terms of a permanent installation. I still hope that someday the Atheneum will make room. The arts in the 19th century. That was one of the contributions I tried to make through Dorothy Archibald, who began her patronage of the Atheneum, her first gifts to the Atheneum in the decorative arts. She was extremely generous when we were doing the reinstallation and brought some extraordinary works of the federal period, which we were weak in, early 19th century. The tambour desk, the New Jersey federal period clock. And we began acquiring early 19th century furniture and then later 19th century furniture and decorative arts. And my acquisition program really ground to a halt shortly after we ran over Patrick McCarthy, who was, after working for Hedberg and acting so respectful of the professional staff, that he basically said acquisition is the work of the curators. Being a director is a full-time job. On my upholstery project, his greatest acquisition was the key thing. It was the first acquisition probably ever made by an American museum because the upholstery was original. And that was something in 1967 that nobody, people, the upholstery that looked shabby, replaced it. And Henry was way ahead of the curve. And we had a couple other things that we just had over the years. I put two and two together, Henry's presence of mind, if you will, and the accidents of just gifts and bequests, and decided to make that a major focal point. I acquired some things. American furniture with original upholstery. It's the finest display of its type in the country. And attracts and deserves to attract the attention of sophisticated collectors and scholars. There's more dramatic ways of presenting the stuff so that the lay audience might better appreciate it. But
we were talking about collecting the Victorian era. You did that show, Victorians and Moderns, I remember.
Yeah,
a little show.
Yeah,
which was an interesting.
It was great fun. That was probably the high watermark of my relationship with Patrick, which. He arrives, anybody around here that is not unencumbered with a collection catalog project could do some work. I happen to have been between projects. I was starting the Japan project, but wasn't deep into it yet. And I said, oh, sure. Let's just throw together something for my collection. We'll do something. And actually, Patrick, I was dragged kicking and screaming into something bigger than what I envisioned. And, I love that kind of dynamic, which, sometimes there's a little creative tension. And I wanted to do something on the Victorian arts. And Patrick, who loathed the Victorians and thought that modernism was a court religion, that it would be more interesting to compare and contrast the Victorians with the moderns. And he was absolutely right on. And I thought it was a better exhibit for having the point-counterpoint aspect. It was truly shocking. I mean, you walk from the Victorians to the moderns, and we had that wonderful room where actually the only little piece that I demanded be grafted on to if we were going to do moderns and modernism, which I find utterly repugnant. At least tell both sides of the period story, which is that modernism was not embraced by everybody. It was especially not embraced in Hartford, which was the center of a national movement called the Colonial Revival, which couldn't be more stigmatized. It couldn't be more beneath contempt. Loathed the Colonial Revival, and yet he got it. Marcel Breuer, right next to Wallace Nutting Reproductions, saying this is the 20th. I love that show, and I think actually Patrick added a big dimension. His design sense was flawless. He had a real theatrical sense. Cecil and Peter Waite, who was then working in the design department, really had, it was the most colorful installation we'd ever done up to that time. Color was used more aggressively in the wall treatments than anything they'd ever done. But I guess this was right after they painted the Morgan Great Hall, so there was sort of this exuberance about color. But it was a very colorful installation. And we brought everything into it: paintings, sculpture, furniture, pottery, silver. It was just as eclectic as any show. I really liked that show. My only regret was that we didn't do it in the Austin Gallery, and we should have toured it around the country. There was a lot of demand for it. Juxtapositions of weird things, and thinking, boy, this is not your father's art museum. And then we went right on from that to the reception room, which was really exciting. And I would count that as the high water mark of my career in terms of teamwork. The Three Musketeers, Jared Edwards, Kathy Marr, and I, there was absolutely no hierarchy at all. This was not Bill's project. This was our project. And Jared just threw himself into it. This is a life passion. This is a guy with just a brilliant eye and a deep sense of reverence and love for the 19th century.
The exit interview tape stopped at this point, but that wasn't the end of my Atheneum adventure. Patrick McCackey challenged the curators to be part of a lecture series on things we were working on. My presentation explored two topics, both later 19th century: the influence of Japan on American art, and a deep dive into the Elizabeth Hart Colt collection, so rich in unique documentation of her life at the Colt's Hartford estate Armsmere and Sam Colt's work and legacy generally. The Japan Idea exhibition opened in 1990 and was an eclectic cornucopia of Japanism, a style of decorative arts that was at a fever pitch from the time of the American Centennial in 1876 through the 1880s. In my view, one of the most interesting art movements in American history. I wrote a book about it that can be found on Amazon. The Colt exhibition in 1996 was bigger and became my swan song at the Atheneum. Although not quite as big as the Great River, it was my proudest achievement because it focused attention on a largely neglected part of the collection, because it redeemed Elizabeth Colt from obscurity, because it was wildly eclectic, because of all the wonderful programs we did around it, and because, thanks to Darrell Perch and Jack Davis at the Hartford Courant, it spawned the Coltsville National Historic Park, a program of the National Park Service. It was an art show and a historic preservation initiative that attracted one of the largest audiences in the museum's history. 25 years later, most of the Colt Armory buildings then at risk have been saved and converted to new uses, and Hartford is on its way to having a state-of-the-art national park expected to add 100,000 visitors per year when it is fully operational. With Japan behind me and Colt in the works, in 1992, Jared Edwards, the late David Ransom, and the then director of the Mark Twain House, John Boyer, and I had a meeting to discuss what to make of Hartford's increasingly influential identity as one of the shining stars of the Gilded Age, a moniker Hartford's Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner gave that age. Short version, we came up with the idea that became Historic Hartford. One of our ideas was to develop a Gilded Age trail that might do for Hartford what the Freedom Trail did for Boston. Our debut event in 1993 was a weekend-long, all-hands-on-deck deep dive into things Hartford and Victorian, with programs and activities at the Atheneum, Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe houses, and a dozen other related locations around the city. It was thrilling. It spawned the Hartford Courant's Twain's World series, which became a whole thing that wound up going in a somewhat different direction. The mission of Historic Hartford was to develop the trail with a programs and marketing initiative, the goal being to double or triple tourism visitation to Hartford. It never got entirely off the ground, nor has any Hartford tourism initiative since, a topic explored on my YouTube channel, so please subscribe. I always had side hustles, until we had children, worked crazy hours, always making time to do as much as possible. I don't necessarily recommend it. Place has been the common denominator of my work. While Greater Hartford and much of Connecticut has been my focus, I also spent a decade in this work in Vermont, a time and place that was a big influence on me. One of my favorite ever programs was Knowing a Town from Its Artifacts with the Sheldon Museum in Middlebury, Vermont, a 2.5-day immersion experience for a group up to their necks in the coolest old stuff of that town and region, a model I wish I'd been more successful at applying in other places I know and care about: Hartford, Norwich, New London, New Haven, and Rockingham, Vermont. A few random things. In 1993, I pivoted back to early American furniture where I developed some influence. We did this Sense of Place Furniture from New England Towns exhibition that wrapped a borrowed exhibit about Portsmouth furniture into something bigger. We added 2 side exhibitions, one on Hadley chests, one of Euro-America's earliest contributions to American art, and a second that focused on Connecticut furniture in our galleries. We organized a conference on regional furniture with the Chipstone Foundation, which published the papers in their house journal, American Furniture. Also, a catalog by Suzanne Flint and Phil Zay on Hadley chests. The conference was coordinated with the Connecticut Antique Show and attracted 400 registrants, a huge number for us. In 1989, I organized an exhibition on Wallace nutting for the Charter Oak Cultural Center. It was far more expansive and biographical than our nutting galleries. Earlier in the 80s, we created a traveling exhibition on chairs, a couple dozen buttes from storage, 1670s to 1950s. Opened at the Brattleboro Museum, it was the kind of lone show from storage that could be a cottage industry for the Atheneum. I love public speaking, which I began in 1975. As a curator, I never had more than about $1,500 a year for a travel budget. As a curator of American art, I thought it terribly important to get around and see what others had and were doing. After the nutting, the American galleries, and the Great River, I was invited to speak at museums, some far from Connecticut and Vermont. What's it all mean? The opportunity to be a curator of one of the nation's first and best public collections at the height of what I call the decorative arts movement was a great joy and privilege. I left that work when I didn't see more mountains to climb, which turned out to be when the movement was beginning to fade anyway. Curators manage collections, and I did plenty of cataloging, collecting, and deaccessioning, the act of pruning that, when done right, makes the collection richer and stronger. But collection management is the least of what a curator does. Curators need also be scholars, advocates, communicators, educators, fundraisers, grant writers, and storytellers. Donor development is part of it as well. In my case, since it was my natural proclivity and the collection I cared for was so rooted in place, our work can also influence how the communities we serve reflect, understand, and hopefully preserve their own histories and art histories. I happen to choose Connecticut and the Connecticut Valley, Hartford being the capital of both. It was and is a road less taken, but for me has made all the difference.